では続きまして次の講演に行きます。ハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生よりご講演いただきます。ナイ先生は歴代のアメリカ民主党政権で国務次官補などの要職を務められました。最近はスマートパワーという概念を提唱されています。また知日派の国際政治学者として日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。演題は The Future of the American Liberal World Order、 アメリカが構築した自由主義的世界秩序の行方です。ではナイ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be back with you at the Tokyo International University again. I am going to say a few words about the world order, but I perhaps should start by saying that, as Henry Kissinger recently wrote in a book on world order, there has never been a world order. Sometimes people complain about how disorderly the world is today. They forget that it's also been disorderly in the past. Nonetheless, it is true that there is a degree of order, and the order we see in world politics is usually associated with the existence of a powerful government. So in the 19th century, we saw that Great Britain provided such things as an open international trading system, relatively stable currency, freedom of the seas, and so forth. And this was a form or degree of world order. The United States becomes the world's most powerful economy in 1900. And in 1917, the United States sends 2 million troops to Europe, which tips the balance in World War I. But after that, the United States returns home. And in the 1920s and 30s, Britain has been too badly weakened by World War I to be able to contribute to world order, and the United States is too immature to pick up its share of the burden. The net result is during the 20s and 30s, you have no country which is providing a global public good. And the result is a Great Depression and eventually the onset of World War II. After 1945, the Americans learned a lesson from their failure in the interwar period, and they decide that they will indeed remain overseas and will indeed continue to try to provide a degree of global order. And that has been true for now some 70 years. That the degree to which we have an international order has depended upon that forward American position. Now, there are some who say that's coming to an end, that the American world order is about to collapse, and with it will go globalization. During the period of a world order, we've seen the advance of trade and investment, which has been beneficial economically for the world as a whole. For example, during the period when Britain provided the degree of world order, there was an extraordinary rise and advance of globalization. This, of course, was disrupted in 1914 by the collapse of World War I. And it's interesting that the world did not recover the same levels of trade that it had in 1914 until 1970. The key question, of course, for today is, will the globalization, which has enriched so many parts of the world, will this be able to continue? Or if the American order collapses, will globalization collapse as well? There's a column by the Financial Times columnist Philip Stevens, who says that the 1945 world order is now under severe challenge, and this is the beginning of the end of the era of globalization. I don't believe that. I think it's wrong, though it's a very popular thing to write these days by various editorial writers. Let me explain to you my reasoning and why I think this view is wrong. The general premise is that the United States is in decline and is unable to provide a global world order. But I think that premise is badly stated and incorrect factually. When we look at the question of decline, it's true that you can find public opinion polls in which Americans and others will say the country is in decline. But frankly, that tells you about the psychology of Americans, not about our realities. Americans always worry about decline, and you can see it cycles in the polls about this. But if you look at the most recent period, the period since 1945, you'll see that after the Russians or the Soviets launched Sputnik in the 1957, there was a belief that America was in decline and the Soviets were 10 feet tall. In the 1980s, when Japan was doing so well with its industrial model, there was a view that Japan was 10 feet tall and the Americans were in decline. One of my colleagues wrote the famous book, Japan as Number One. In the period after the economic recession of 2008, the view was the Chinese were 10 feet tall and that the United States had been overtaken by China. As I said, this tells you more about psychology than about power reality. If you look at power reality, you have to look at the concept of decline and separate it into two different aspects. There's absolute decline and there's relative decline. Absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome. Ancient Rome didn't decline because of the rise of a new empire. It wasn't the Persians or something that replaced Rome. Rome declined because of internal civil wars and because it had an economy with no productivity. It did not grow richer unless it did it by conquest. It had no internal sources of productivity. So that when Rome declined, it declined not to attacks from another country or empire. It declined because of hordes of barbarians and its inability to defend itself against barbarians, as well as its own internal civil wars. Now, if you look at the United States today and you say, do we see absolute decline? I suggest the answer is no. If you look at demographics, the United States is the only rich country in the world which is going to preserve its position in terms of population. Today, the largest country in terms of population is China, followed by India, followed by the United States. In 2050, according to United Nations demographers, the ranking will be India number one, China number two, but number three will still be the United States. And the reason is because we've been open to immigration. Not just fertility, but immigration, which is really going to maintain the American position in terms of population. Another indicator of why the United States is not in decline objectively would be the energy situation. 10 years ago, if we looked at the United States, we would have said that the United States was becoming hopelessly dependent upon imported energy, particularly energy from the Middle East. And this was going to sap American power, reduce American strength. Well, what happened? What happened was you had technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which were combined to loose the gas and oil reserves of shale. And that shale has produced a revolution in energy. So much so that the International Energy Agency in Paris believes that North America may be energy independent in the 2020s. So that previous projection of continuous decline because of energy dependence is no longer true. A third indicator you might look at for why objectively the United States is not in absolute decline would be the questions of the technologies which are going to shape this century. Many people would say the key technologies are going to be biotechnology, nanotechnology, or materials technology more broadly, and third, information technology in its latest incarnation, which is sometimes called the fourth industrial revolution, but think of it as big data and artificial intelligence applied to information. If you ask what country is at the forefront of all three of these technologies, the United States. That's not like ancient Rome. And then if you ask the question of what about the underlying structure of production of science and technology which can maintain this, it's interesting that if you look at the ranking of global universities done by China's Shanghai Jiaotong University, of the top 20 universities in the world, 15 are in the United States. So this picture that the United States is in decline, like ancient Rome, is simply not consistent with the facts. There's another question, though, which is relative decline. Even if a country like the United States is doing very well, the question is, are there others who are doing even better? And there we have to ask, who are the other countries which might be able to replace the United States? One would be Europe. If one looks at the total size of the European economy when it acts as one, and population, where it's larger than the United States, then Europe would be a potential competitor for replacing the United States as the provider of global order. The problem, of course, is that Europe does not act with that unity. And the recent British decision to Brexit is an illustration of the nature of this problem. A second possible contender might be Russia. But if you look at Russia carefully, you'll see that Russia is a country that is in decline. It is basically a country which is shrinking demographically, has severe health problems. For example, the average Russian male dies at age 64. I suspect the average Japanese male dies around age 85 or 87, which is more normal in the developed world. Russia is also what you might call a one-crop economy. 2/3 of its exports depend on oil and gas. And it is so corrupted that it can't make the reforms it needs to deal with the so-called fourth industrial revolution. That is not necessarily a good thing, because a country which is in decline is often more willing to accept risks than a country that is rising. It has less optimism. It takes greater risks. For example, in 1914, before World War I, The country that wanted war among the great powers was Austria-Hungary, which was in decline. It expected a different war than the one it got, but nonetheless it was willing to take greater risks. So we should not feel good about the decline of Russia. It means that Putin is taking a number of risky actions to try to prove Russia's greatness in the world, rather than dealing with these underlying causes that would really restore Russia. So, as contenders for replacing the United States as the provider of world order, Europe lacks unity. Russia is moving in the wrong direction. Very often people say, well, what about India, which is growing at the rate of 7.5% a year? And India is indeed doing very well, but it's still very much a developing country. With an economy worth $2 trillion, the United States economy now is $18 trillion. So a long way to go for India. So if you ask what country then could possibly pass the United States, most people wind up with China. And the argument is that China is the next superpower and will replace the United States. But that again does not stand up to careful scrutiny of the facts. There are some who said in answer to a public opinion poll in the United States a few years ago that they believed that China had already passed the United States or soon would. This is at a period when China was growing at 10% a year and the US was not growing at all because of the recession. The result was the view that China was passing the United States. But in practice, if you look, you'll see that China is an economy of roughly $10 trillion. The United States, as I mentioned, $18 trillion. So they haven't passed. And the question as people look into the future, is there a period when China will be larger than the US in its total economic size? And the answer is maybe, but not as soon as people think. If you look at the growth rate that people project in China, it now is officially 6.5%. But my colleagues at Harvard, like Larry Summers, have done studies which have looked at previous countries like Japan, which have had 10% growth rates, and asked what would you expect as a return to normal, what the economists call a regression to the mean. And they estimate that Chinese growth in the 2020s is more likely to be about 3.9%. Well, if you see China growing at 3.9% and the US growing at 2%, then the period in which China, or the date by which China would be larger than the US in total size, looks more like the late 2030s or perhaps 2040s. And even then, China won't be the equal of the United States in per capita income, which is a better measure of the sophistication of the economy, where the US is 4 times larger. What's more, we've just talked about economic power, but power has 3 dimensions. There's economic power, there's military power, and there's soft power. If one looks at China's military power, yes, it has been growing impressively, but it's still only 1/4. The Chinese military budget is still only 1/4 that of the United States. And it's implausible to see China being able to project power globally in the next 20, 30 years at a manner that would be equivalent to the United States. Similarly, if you look at China's soft power, China does benefit from the attractiveness of its culture and from its economic performance, but it also has problems. 2 problems in particular limit China's soft power. One is the fact that the Communist Party is unwilling to unleash the creativity of Chinese civil society. Much of American and Japanese soft power comes from civil society. If you look at China, the Chinese Communist Party hesitates to allow the freedom to civil society that is necessary. The other problem that China has with soft power is the number of territorial disputes that it has with its neighbors. It's very hard to create goodwill by creating a Confucius Institute to teach Chinese culture in a national capital if at the same time your ships or soldiers are contesting a border with the country. So I don't see China replacing the US in soft power either. Indeed, a recent study by a London consultancy, Portland, which had what it called the Soft Power 30, ranking countries in the world in terms of soft power. The United States came out number 1, Japan also ranked very high, China came out number 28. So in all these three dimensions of power, I don't see China about to pass the US. Now what does that mean? It means that the dangers that might occur of a 1930s scenario or 1920s scenario where Britain collapses but the United States did not take over, that's not about to happen now. The United States is not about to collapse and China's not about to take over. And that means that the liberal international order, which has been supportive of globalization, can be preserved. Now, it doesn't mean that it will be easily done. It'll be easier in some places than others. Frankly, my own view about the future of Asia is relatively optimistic, so long as the United States and Japan maintain our alliance. The US-Japan alliance has been the basis for stability in the post-Cold War international order in East Asia. And I believe there's a strong commitment in both countries to maintaining it. All my Japanese friends tell me it's crucial. We heard it earlier from Mr. Kimura. I also think that if we look at the dangers that Russia presents, and they are very real, as I mentioned, they also are countered by the American alliance in Europe, NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. And that means that that sets limits on how much mischief that Putin can create in Europe. So if you look at the great power relationships, and you look at Asia, and you look at Europe, yes, they're very real problems. North Korea is a case in point that we just heard. Or in Europe, we still have the problem of Ukraine and the Russian meddling in Ukraine. But we're not about to see a collapse in the order in either of those regions. The area that worries me far more is the Middle East. And I worry about the Middle East because there are a series of revolutions going on there that may last for decades. But I'm going to leave this to my friend Vali Nasser, who's the next speaker, who knows much more about the region than I do. But I do think that there are problems of preserving order in the Middle East, and that, I think, is going to be the area where you'll see the greatest challenges. But in Asia and Europe, and in the great power relationship, I think the American alliance with Japan in this region and with the European countries in NATO will preserve the order which is necessary for maintaining the international public goods and the framework for economic globalization that has served us well so far. So if we had to summarize all that, I would say it's a message which is mostly optimistic, but with an exception. And the exception is going to be the topic that will be addressed by the next speaker. So I'm leaving him all the difficult problems. But in terms of the area that we are located today and where we have most direct concern,
So long as we maintain the very close relations between the U.S. and Japan, and I think we will, then I remain relatively optimistic. So thank you for your attention.
ありがとうございました。アメリカの正義は終わっていないという強いメッセージをいただきました。そして次の講演への橋渡しもいただきました。ナイ先生、どうもありがとうございました。もう一度